All right, we are live. Hi, Simon.
Hey, Paula, how are you today?
I'm doing great. It's towards the end of the summer. That's usually a little bit like, oh no, but
Yeah.
it's
You're you're in southern Spain, so you have like beautiful weather all year round. I'm like getting ready to put on big sweaters. It's actually like summer's over here in Denmark. It's done. So yeah, I'm like pulling out all the big sweaters and the fuzzy socks and everything like that. And yeah, yeah, it's over now. So that's okay. That's okay. You
all
know.
right. Well, hang in there, hang in there.
I'm not like totally pale. I got through the summer and I got a little bit of color, so I'm happy with that. That's just that's a big win for me.
Happy. Yeah. Awesome. So what do we have today?
Yeah, so we have a few more people coming in, but we'll get started really shortly. If you are here to talk about working across cultures. And of course, like the types of professionals that we work with, usually it's around English training and second language English training. But today we're talking about a subject that really, I mean, everybody we talk to, whether it be HR, operations, marketing, software development, what have you. Especially right now, it seems like everybody is working in a more global sense, working across cultures, and that's why these seem to be very popular for us. And so, yeah, we're going to go through some different tips and tricks of working across cultures, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, this is my favorite topic to discuss.
It's such a great topic. And I think it's also very, very important because sometimes, especially when we work in an environment where we speak English, and we're not native English speakers, we focus a lot on the words and the grammar. But there's so much more to it, like learning how we all interact and how we all behave based on our culture. It just makes a whole difference. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where it's like you're seeing through another lens, right? And that's what we really want to talk about today is how can we all get those culture glasses on so we can see situations through a different lens and really open us up to some different perspectives. So yeah, I think it will be fun. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So if this is your first Talaera webinar, welcome. We're so excited that you're here. If you're just showing up, just so you kind of have an idea about Talaera, what we do is we provide business English communication training for companies across the world. So, we work with professionals who are in operations, marketing, HR, what have you, all different industries, all different roles. And we basically try to make it as efficient for you to communicate in your second language in English as possible. And we really do a lot of different trainings around that. And of course, today we'll be talking about the cross-cultural aspect of it, which again is not, it's not something, and I think we're going to be very forward about this, that this isn't something that's just for second language English learners. This is for everybody. If you're working in a global context, then this is for you. So let's do some just really quick introductions. My name's Simon Kennel. I'm the People and Culture Manager at Talaera. Like many Talaerians, I started actually as a trainer with Talaera while I was doing my master's degree. And then, as our team grew, we realized the need for a P&C manager. And here I am now. And Paula, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm currently the marketing and content director here at Talaera, but just like you, I started as a business English instructor. I'm also reading everyone's comments in here. That's awesome. I see that we have people, by the way, in Portugal, Melbourne, Israel, China, Switzerland, India, New York City, Barcelona, Paris, China,
Oh,
well,
wow.
Netherlands. So we do have a lot in there. Hungary, Senegal. Just make sure that the chat works for you because we'll be asking questions throughout, and that you send it all to everyone. Otherwise, if you see host and panelists, I will only see it, but not everyone else. So just make sure about that. Myself, I am in Spain, in Valencia at the moment. And I've been into communication and cross-cultural communication for over 10 years, or ever since I can remember. So I'm happy to walk everyone through what we have today.
Yeah. And again, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So jump in the chat. Let us know, yeah, where you're calling in from. Again, we're talking about, communicating across cultures. So this is perfect to hear where you're calling in from. And yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting. We have a lot of questions today that are going to touch on some different aspects that it'll be very, I think, cool to see what some of the different answers are. So what are we actually talking about today? We're going to cover three big areas. And again, you might have seen at the beginning, this is just part one. Like there are so many different levels to this whole culture topic that we always go through that, we really felt today is really just a kind of a first taste to get a sense of how we go through these types of trainings. And we're going to focus on these three kind of big points. Number one, cultural intelligence. So what is that? You may have seen this term CQ thrown around. We're going to really kind of dive into that, but diving into it from a personal sense of we're starting with the self and then we're going to go outwards. That'll make a little bit more sense as we go through. And then we're going to talk about relationship building. And Paula, what are we going to cover there?
So here it's really understanding how we all bond with each other, how we all create relationships. We may think that it's similar across the board, but it's not. So we'll see how different people engage in small talk, how we build trust, especially at work. But I guess you can apply this to all the areas of your life, right?
Right, exactly right. And that's one of the things, right? If you showed up thinking, I just want to know how to write an email across cultures, like we're going to get a little bit bigger than that, right? So we're going to talk about a few of these points, but it's going to be a little bit deeper than that. We're also going to talk about collaborating. How do we collaborate? What are the differences with direct and indirect cultures, and how do we navigate that? And then time perception. These are some things that maybe you're looking at this initially and thinking, wow, okay, I don't really know, these differences. That's great. That's perfect. We're not just going to talk about the differences, but we're also going to talk about strategies to then navigate those, right? So that's the big thing is everybody today should walk away with a few tools that you can use right away that you can start implementing. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump into it. And we're starting with cultural intelligence. So when we talk about cultural intelligence, what does that mean, Paula?
Ooh, so that's a big topic. So when we talk about cultural intelligence, it really has to do with being aware of what other cultures are and also being uncomfortable with not knowing everything. So here we have culture is the software of the mind. Obviously, when we talk about different cultures, it's very important not to fall into stereotypes. Mm-hmm. So it's really not only about reading, how do Americans communicate? I'm going to read about it and I'm going to assume that everyone in the United States communicate like that. It's much more than that. It's really understanding that we're all individuals, but there are patterns, and those patterns can help us really, communicate and work better with other cultures. But it really goes back to that. How can I be respectful and being okay with not knowing everything and being uncomfortable?
And I think you raised a great point there around like lazy culture training is like, Americans are like that, and Brits are like that, and Chinese are like this, and it is lazy in a sense because ultimately we are all individuals, right? When we talk about cultural awareness training, it's exactly that. It's having the awareness. We talk about having those lenses on. When we have the awareness, it's going to give us a different perspective, which can help us communicate more effectively, right? Too often, I think we try to put people in boxes because then that makes it easier for us to rationalize it, right? Okay, Paula from Spain, she's probably like this. Okay, now I feel comfortable because I know everything about Paula and I can put a stamp on that, right? That's not what we're going for today. Today, we're going to talk about how we can navigate this kind of uncertainty to make it easier for us to connect on that person-to-person level. And so there's a ton of great resources when it comes to cultural training. This one on the left here of your screen, this culture iceberg, I think is a great representation around what's visible versus what's less visible, right? What is it that we first see? We first see the dress or the language or the food, what have you. But there's so much more under that, right? The buildup of the software, right? The software of the mind, all of the values and beliefs and all of that that's been built up over a lifetime to then now you're meeting this person. And we have to be careful again not to put people in that box, right? There's also Hofstede and Aaron Meyer, which I know, Paula, you're a huge fan of, right?
Yeah, she's wonderful. I always recommend this book, The Culture Map, when you're working across cultures. We launched, by the way, a poll 3 minutes ago where we asked, do you work with people from other cultures? And I see that 97% of our attendees here replied, yes, I do. So that's definitely for you. 4 people also said, I don't work with people from other cultures now, but I would love to. This is a great way. Aaron Mayer is a great writer for you to get to know other cultures and expand your awareness, your cultural awareness. Yeah. If anyone has any other tips, put them in the chat, because after today, we're going to collect a lot of the resources that we have apart from this webinar and these slides, and we'll share them with you. So if you have any tips, always put that in the chat.
Yeah. And that's, I think, a great point is even if you're not working across cultures right now, this is something exactly like you said, you can start to develop that skill and start to educate and do that. And it's great to see so many people here today that are working across cultures. That's awesome. Okay, so getting into this, right? Let's really dive deep into this. When we're talking about cultural intelligence, right? There's a lot that goes into it, but it's ultimately what we talked about of being the ability to navigate situations, to navigate cross-cultural situations, right? Now, you have probably been in situations where you're walking into a room and it's very clear that you are the minority or you are the other, right? And if you've ever had that feeling or had that happen to you, you know that, okay, yeah, one of these is not like the other here. I feel maybe out of place. I feel like I maybe don't belong. How do both parties in that situation navigate that, right? And if you can do that in a way that you feel comfortable, where you feel that you can be yourself, but still navigating those cultural differences, that's a huge plus. I mean, I remember one of the first meetings I had when I worked in Saudi Arabia. I walked into a room and it was only Arabic, and I was just sitting there like this, and I was, a little bit of a culture shock. And that was one of those moments where I had to kind of check myself and think, okay, how can I handle this difference? How do I know this? And so here are some things that you can do for yourself to increase, your cultural intelligence. Which of these, Paula, do you feel like kind of stands out for you as the most important?
Really, all of them, but probably if I were to pick just one, that would be cultural exposure and reflection. That's one that I think is super important. But I mean, all of them, starting from the beginning, to increase your cultural intelligence, you first have to really understand your own cultural background and your own culture. So that's the first step. Traveling whenever possible. I know now things are getting easier, but for the last 2 years, that's been a little tricky. But traveling also means traveling, even if virtually, to other places and be in touch with people from other cultures. Also testing yourself. We're going to drop, when we send the slides, we're going to drop some tests. And that, what we mean by that is really understanding, do I have any biases? Do I have any unfair stereotypes? That, the first step is to be aware of them. So test yourself, see where you are. Having international work experience, I see almost 100% of the people here do have international work experience, even if they do it from their own country. But now with everyone working remotely, we're starting to really understand and be more okay with the cultural differences. That's also part of your cultural intelligence, right? Like being okay with those differences. Language acquisition, learning another language. We learned that people think differently, that there are other ways of saying the same thing, and they're absolutely perfect. That really opens your mind. Um, and yes, we said cultural exposure and reflection. How can we do that? I'm going to throw that question back at you.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times there's the impulse to think, okay, well, it's maybe easy for someone to go and work remotely for 3 months in Europe, or to go and do this, but I am in Minnesota, or in, my whichever country I'm in, and I don't have the ability to just leave and go and live in a different culture. That doesn't need to be that way. There are cultural differences in your own community. It's ultimately about putting yourself in a situation, or putting yourself in an environment that you're not very familiar with culturally. And there's many ways to do that, many different cultural exposure opportunities in your own community. I think a big thing is just finding them. But the big point is, if there are any people here listening that have ever worked in a different country, or have lived in a different country than your own home country, that feeling of, it's not so comfortable for me. It's just a little bit uncomfortable. I have to go out of my comfort zone. I have to go out of my shell a little bit to be able to navigate that. This is something that it's just like any other type of training. You want to try to do a little bit more of, because it's pushing your own boundaries. It's pushing how you can navigate that. But then on the back end, you also want to reflect on that. And reflection is a huge part in any learning process. It's a huge part of how do we make that stick, right? What did I feel? How did I feel, when I was in that meeting with all of those gentlemen in Saudi Arabia? How did I feel? What was that feeling like? Okay, what did I do to maybe navigate that? What did I add to the meeting, right? And you can really learn a lot just by your own reflection, by
Yeah.
doing that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm reading a lot in the chat. So Mariana said, for me, the best way to break the barriers is to travel as much as you can, work related or not, to see and learn from different cultures in a more relaxed environment. That's
Hmm.
absolutely right. I see a few people also agree with her. Ava also said traveling helps a lot. I 100% agree. I mean, we have millions of examples or like hundreds of examples where you just travel to a different place and then you start learning, oh, wait, there's another way of doing things, and
Yeah.
it's to work for them. And that's awesome. And then your mind just broadens, right?
Right, right. Yeah. And traveling, I think it's important to specify, doesn't necessarily mean going to, a different country and then staying in a little perimeter resort where you never, actually leave the little bubble. It's about getting out there and getting your hands, dirty, and being in a restaurant where nobody else speaks your language, right? And really being in that situation. And that's where you're going to have that kind of uncomfortable stretching, that learning that you're actually feeling. And that's going to be very helpful for you. Now, we're going to really quickly go through these kind of checklists and questions, because they are really important, of how do we start with the self when we're working across cultures. It's often so easy to just jump into, other cultures are like this and you should watch out for this. But when we talk about cultural intelligence, it starts with the self, right?
Absolutely. So here, I think that the part 2 and 3 of the webinar today are going to be about really understanding those specific cultural differences. But we cannot assume that we will have the capacity to learn about all the different cultures. So before that, there's this two like very important checklists, as you said. Like one is to have the mindset checklist. So it starts with the self. What mentality do I have, or what mindset do I have when I come into this cross-cultural situation? And then it goes to finding out, asking the right questions when you don't know something. I read a comment that I loved here in the
Mhm.
chat, that how when we talk about companies, we talk about culture fit.
Yeah.
And Jacinta said it's about culture add. You add
Mm.
to your team. How
I love
brilliant.
that. Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, we do all have something to add, 100%, and we're going to see that more and more. I mean, there's study after study that shows that an intercultural team will have a greater diversity of outcomes, of thought, of ideas, and will in the long term be more effective than just like a total monoculture team. So yeah, you're adding value 100%. This mindset checklist, right? Like, I think this is a great kind of walkthrough to do for yourself. It's like a self scan before you're going into a situation where, you may be working in a different culture, or you may be going to a meeting internationally. Now it's so easy when we do this, over Zoom and what have you. But these are a few things to kind of watch out for. So number one is just checking assumptions, right? Checking assumptions and biases. Now this can be you have to be very objective with yourself, being very honest with yourself. What do I assume to be true or false, or what could I assume to be true or false? Asking yourself in that way, how could those assumptions influence me? I think it's always great to start there, thinking about, okay, what am I just right now? I already have it, like we talked about, in this box. I already have that in this box. How could those assumptions, let's not even judge that I have them, just how could those influence me even before I get to this interaction, right? And then, when we're actually getting to the interaction, thinking about which me am I going to bring to this, right? Am I going to bring the hangry, grouchy Simon who's a little bit tired and I just need to get this done, and you know what, I don't care if they don't get it or not. I'm just going to give it to them and then they're going to go. Is it going to be that me, or is it going to be the me that's okay? Yeah, I hope not, right? I try not. I try to eat a snack before a meeting. That's a big one. But I try to come with this attitude and energy that is here of just like what we talked about, adding value. How will this energy help me learn and build and achieve with this person, right? With this group? How can we find this together? And then number three is preparing for ambiguity. And this isn't even, I think, a question you can ask yourself. It's really just a checklist item of, hey, it might not be totally 100% black and white clear for you. It might be that you're not totally sure what they meant by that, or maybe you can see on their face that they're not really sure, and there's that bit of ambiguity. You just have to be prepared for that. And it is a mindset shift, I think.
It totally is. And so once you have that, you check for assumptions and biases, like what do I have within my head, right? And then you're fully present in there, and you're okay with the gray, with the gray situations where not everything is black or white. And then you come in, I also read in the chat, Jacinta has some great ideas as well, is the difference between being, there's two mindsets, the judger, she said, and the learner. So we want to be the learner for sure. And then here's where we learn, okay, how do I ask when I don't know something? Because that's life, right? You're not going to know everything about every single culture. And that's where we come in, like, how do we ask the right question?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. So yeah, definitely. Asking those questions, right? Walk us through these, because I think you're great at forming these questions as tools that really help us. What should we cover here?
So there's a lot of things we could talk about. We could do a whole webinar just talking about how to ask questions. I love asking questions. Like, if you ask any of my friends, seriously, they always tell me your sentences or like your phrases. Oh, I have a question. Like, I always have a question, right? And so again, there's many things we could say, but just for the sake of summarizing, the first one is to ask open-ended questions. There's usually two types of questions. One's the ones that you can answer with yes, no. Those are close-ended questions. And the open-ended questions that usually start with what, why, how, when, where. So, instead of saying, do you think this will be ready tomorrow? Like, will this be ready tomorrow? Turn that into a more open-ended question with, when do you think the slides will be ready? Yeah. Or instead of saying, do you like this method? That's close-ended. Turn it into open-ended with, what are your thoughts about this method? This very simple trick can avoid a lot of frustrations in a multicultural environment. Apart from being the learner, apart from being more culturally intelligent, it really saves a lot of time and conflict and frustration. Because we'll talk about this later, but saying yes and no can be a little difficult for some cultures. We'll talk about that, but it can really, make a big difference. So that's the first one, ask open-ended questions. The second one, when you're asking about someone's culture, is to add that generally, usually, typically. And you can also depersonalize it. So instead of saying, do you always get on time? You can say, typically, how do people in your culture approach punctuality?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, like you said, it's depersonalizing it, like, are you, Paula, like, are people in Spain, like, are you always late? Is that how you come to meetings? Like, it just feels so invasive, right? Versus pushing that away of a little bit, like, how would you say people are, usually approach this? Or yeah, what's the general approach? I love that. It really kind of makes it a little bit more safe to discuss.
That's it. And then always ask follow-up questions. This works for many, like in many directions, but the two most important ones is to really make sure that you understood. So learn how to ask good follow-up questions, to really understand like the core of the issue. But it also shows the other person that you are that learner, that you are open-minded enough to really be, have that interest in finding out what they truly mean. So for example, what led to that decision, or what would you like to see happen, to really understand the underlying reasons. And all these questions, again, there's so much more we could talk about. There's a lot we can do, and it also obviously works for cross-cultural communication, but it's a skill, asking the right questions, that you can apply. Lorena said it in the chat, that you can apply to people from your own culture.
Yeah. Ultimately, it ends with us how we're approaching a situation, an interpersonal communication situation. How can we approach that? Being more open, being more honest, and being more ready for collaboration and finding an agreement. And that's really where we start to see that value take place. Okay, we do also have a podcast, Talaera Talks podcast. So if you want to check out, we have a lot of cool podcasts around this. Asking better questions is just one of those. We're going to move on now to a huge point here. And we have, again, so much stuff today. So we will be sending all the slides to everybody. But relationship building is a huge part of cross-cultural, working, and how do we do that? And small talk is something that people come to us all the time. It's actually insane how many people write to us wanting to do specific courses on small talk. Because it really is that first situation where someone comes in, maybe it's their first day on the job, maybe they're just meeting their new boss and they want to make a great impression, right? They want to come in and start off on a strong foot. And if they're doing that in a different culture, small talk is one of those things of like, how do I do this, right? And here's an example, right? So, I think this is I don't know, like, Paula, what do you think about this as just in general, like on a rating 1 to 5, 5 being a great conversation, what would you give this? And I'm going to open this up to the chat too. What would you give this on a rating of 1 to 5? I mean, I don't know.
I mean, yeah. So here when we have, so how are you doing today? Here, this person is really trying to engage in conversation, right? And the other person says, good. And then the person with the gray box says, well, thanks for the time to hop on a call and review our product. So they just don't know what to say, and they just jump on straight to the conversation. They're like, you're welcome. So for me, these
awkward. Yeah. A 1 out of 1, awkward, 100%. And this is something that unfortunately we see a lot of all the time. And when I've had students and this was taken from, one of our clients that I've worked with about this, just the very clear pauses, right? And how do we do that? How do we create the flow of developing small talk across cultures? There's actually a science to it, right? And here's the second example that we can use in thinking about this, right? It's a little bit different. I mean, Paula, what do you think about what is the real difference between these two?
So we actually have a webinar just on small talk where we give the recipe for small talk and how to keep it engaging. But the person now here, Alex, has learned, and they're doing it a bit better. So they're adding a little bit of detail to the question, and they're ending with a full question as well. So it's not "and you," but it's more like, okay, but how about yourself? Or have you been trying to close some big projects, or where's your team going? They ask questions to really say, okay, I'm here, I'm engaging. This is a two-way street. So much better for sure.
And this is what we're going to talk about, right? Is how do we do this? Because maybe if you're a native English speaker, this seems like you know, the ABCs, right? This is super easy. It's second nature. But for a huge portion of our clients, they come to us with this exact thing of, they know the importance that small talk plays in developing that business relationship and creating trust, right? And so you do see these kind of back and forth of, you know, the peach cultures and the coconut cultures. And again, not to create two boxes, we want to be very open and a bit fluid here, but there are differences. You know, differences with a peach culture would be, you know, a little bit more friendly and smiling at first, right? They're a little bit more easygoing, would, yeah, jump to the first name, share and ask, this kind of back and forth. But as you go a little bit more, then there's gets this hard pit, right? I would put myself probably over there with the peach cultures. I was raised in the South in the United States, and if you've ever visited there, people will ask you your entire life story in the first 5 minutes of knowing them, right? And that's just kind of how that goes. But what about coconut cultures, Paula?
So coconut cultures are initially, they look very hard on the outside, and they are initially closed off, and they rarely smile at strangers. So if you go to Germany and start smiling at people on the street, they would think like, is this person okay?
Yeah.
So they at the beginning, they don't ask personal questions, but it's only because they take a little bit longer to build relationships. That process is a bit slower. But once you get in, then they're so nice, they're super loyal. And you know, you build those lifelong relationships with them. But what we wanted to really say with this, apart from one, understand that there are some cultural differences in general. Again, we want to emphasize this is a very, very general pattern. It's very easy to fall into stereotypes and prejudices and think that peach cultures are fake and that coconut cultures are all harsh and cold and they're not, you know, they're not friendly. It's really not that. It's really about understanding that it's just two different realities, and you just need to learn how to adapt and not only accept, but leverage those differences. So,
Yeah. And how do we involve, you know, if we have people from different backgrounds or have these different approaches, how do we involve them? I mean, I live in Copenhagen, Denmark, which would be more kind of a coconut culture. And I can start to see some of my own characteristics moving more towards that side as well, right? So for the webinars, I go like full peach culture though. So just to make it a little bit easier for people. But when we talk about, you know, how long should small talk last, I think it's a little bit telling, right? Like we have these different kind of areas in the world, and small talk is what? Like, why do we have small talk? Well, ultimately it's to figure each other out, right? It's to build that initial relationship, because I want to know if I can trust Paula. Like, we're talking a little bit, I want to know a little bit about you, because I kind of want to get the sense if I can trust you. And we'll talk a little bit about trust, how trust is built in different cultures. But it comes to this, right? Is trust is built differently across different cultures. Finland in the top left-hand corner is a perfect example, right? Finland is very much down to the point, because trust is built differently in Finland than it is in the MENA region, for example. And I think this is a little bit telling. I mean, I would love anybody in the chat to please, how long do you think is appropriate to have small talk before you just jump into the meeting? I don't know, like Paolo, what would you say just for your own self? What's an appropriate period of time?
Appropriate is a very loaded, I guess, word, and it depends on where you are.
Right.
And it's also it depends a lot on personality, right? I see people saying 2 minutes in China, 5 to 10 minutes. Let us know where you are. 2 minutes in Belarus. What else? 10 minutes in Gabon. I'm Colombian, but our small talks depend on the personality for sure. That's what we were saying. For me, it really depends. If it's a person that I just met, I guess 10 minutes sounds about right. If not, yeah, if not, then just like 2 or 3 minutes, that's enough. And then we can,
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you?
That's interesting. Well, definitely when I'm here in Denmark, it's like you can't go more than I would say maybe more than a minute is weird. Like then you're being invasive. Don't do that, right? But anytime I go back to the US, it's just it can go on for a while for sure. But so knowing what topics to avoid as well, and we'll just quickly run through this, right? My mother used to call these like dinner table topics, right? Like, what do you need to avoid? Just to be safe, avoiding kind of, religion, money, politics. Those are just, the safe, kind of ones to stay away from. But then there are the okay topics. And again, how are we asking that in a more open-ended way? I think maybe the go-to is weather. I think that's just kind of what what everybody uses. But we talk with a lot of our students on this specifically as well. I mean, I had one client that one time straight up asked me, okay, so like how much money do you make, right? So this is a very direct kind of question that in that culture is okay. It's the just getting to know you, right? But where I'm from, that's like, whoa, that was very intense. But I knew it wasn't him being rude. So I think that's kind of the
exactly. So understanding what kind of topics are okay across cultures really helps build relationships with people from other cultures. We have 2 questions on the next slide, and again, we won't. That's the last bit from small talk, because we could talk on and on and on, about this. But for example, another very what I find very funny or interesting cultural difference when it comes to small talk is, how are you doing and did you eat today? They look like very different questions, but they actually have a lot in common. They're one of the most common icebreakers in some parts of the world. Like in the Western cultures, we tend to say, how are you doing? And in many places, like in the US or in the UK, it just means hello. And you're supposed to reply with, how are you doing? Fine, doing all right, thanks. How about you? Right? You're not supposed to tell the other person how you're doing truly. And then, did you eat today? When I lived in Vietnam, this was something that people would ask me all the time, and I was very puzzled. Like, do I look like fat or too thin or something? Like, do they see like I'm not healthy? And it's just really a way in some Asian cultures to just say hello, right? So did you eat today? That's just an icebreaker. So understanding that will also really help you bond with other people. In China as well, people are saying pal. Awesome. Great. So that's basically how we engage in small talk. But then how do we build trust? This usually here, actually, can you show the next slide? Because I'd love to ask people, who would you trust more if you think about your own self? Would you trust more a person that you can tell you do work consistently, you are very reliable with deadlines, you enjoy working with them? So A. Or would you trust B more, where you can tell them, I've seen who you are, I've shared personal time with you, perhaps you went to afterward drinks, I've had coffee or meals with you, I know people who trust you. So,
and think about this in a professional context, right? So not in a personal context, but professional context. Which one do you trust more, right?
Mhm.
For me, if it's a professional context, I trust A more actually. But that's me, is, I can trust that person professionally. So then it comes from just getting the work done, right? But it may be different. What about you, Paula?
Ah, this is a tough one. I see a lot of A's in here in the chat, not many B's. Well said, Simon. Someone said in the chat as well. So they agree with you. Um, so for me, A is important, but it's not a clear A. It's a gray A. It's like
Yeah.
A, B-ish. Because for me, it's also important to really know the person I'm working with. So I'm not 100% sure. I guess I'm mixed.
Again, it can be fluid, right? And this is where we talk about how trust is
Space
built.
in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. On cue, exactly right. And this is, from Erin Meyer, she brings up this discussion around, how trust is built, relationship built, or if it's built based on, on the context of your work, that you've done this job, and so I can trust you to do this job. And the big clash that happens here is when people from this efficiency side maybe go and work in a relationship-based culture. And then it's like, why are we taking a 2-hour lunch and just talking? This is a total waste of time, right? Or, someone from a relationship-based culture coming over to the US, and then it's just like, are we not going to talk and get to know each other? And is this just so transactional? And how can I trust you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this is really where we see this difference coming in. And I think it's something, again, to be aware of, if you're doing that, so if you're going to work, in Argentina or something like that, then if you're going for a week, just enjoy the long lunches and get to know your colleagues down there, like I would say enjoy it, right? Enjoy the differences there.
Yes, absolutely. And you said before, Simon, that it depends on the context, 100%. Communication, context, collaboration are very, very heavily context dependent. So having that, going back to that cultural intelligence of understanding it's not always A or B, it's not always black or white, is super important. And we have some tips, like very clear tips. So let's say you work with culture that generally values efficiency, and let's say you're from the other side, like you're not about that personality. How can you approach those people? How can you build trust with them? Well, try to be as professional as possible, so keep work related stuff professional. Try to be accurate with your words and with your emails, and punctual, because time is money, and it's important to be there on time. Of course, you can keep socializing. That doesn't mean you have to stop being yourself, but do keep socializing while implementing these other tips. If it's going to be a long lunch, so let's say you are from Egypt
Argentina.
or
Yeah.
Argentina, and you would like to schedule a long lunch, that's totally fine. But if it's going to be more than an hour, let them know in
Yeah.
advance so that they know what to expect. And then if they don't invite you for afterward drinks, then don't take offense. Like, it's just part of the culture.
Right.
But then if you are in a situation where you're dealing with people who really value relationship building, and you're from, let's say, the United States, where it's a little bit less common, try to think long term. It might seem initially like a waste of time, but it really is not. Invest in that relationship. You can still organize meals and drinks, but try to do that after work, in like after hours, so it doesn't disrupt their usual work flow. And again, we want to emphasize that long lunches are not a waste of time. And yeah, just invest in getting to know them.
Yeah. I think it's really easy if you're coming from this, efficiency base, where you have this kind of urge, or maybe this even stress, to jump over that and get to the work part. But that initial relationship building is critical. And if you're in an intercultural team where you have people coming from both sides here, invest in that at the beginning, because that's going to make a huge part of your team feel much more engaged, much more comfortable going forward. And again, you're putting that small investment up front to pay big dividends down the line. Okay, let's keep it moving here. And again, we'll send out all of the slides later today, so you'll have them all. But when we talk about collaborating, we've kind of talked about the self, we've talked about building trust, and now we want to get into collaborating. And for today, just because we have so much, we're going to go a little bit faster through this section, but it is still going to be fun. There's a few quizzes that I want people to pay attention to here. We're going to talk about direct and indirect cultures, and what does that mean? Again, just like everything, it's fluid, it's a scale, but when we talk about direct and indirect cultures, I think this first one right here is just the best example ever. That's wrong.
Yeah. So what do people think? Like, what do you think when you read this? Not only if it's direct or indirect, but do you find it fine? Or is that too, that's harsh and it hurts? Like, what does it feel like to you? Just professional or
I feel
harsh?
a little hurt. It's salty. It's like, yeah, I don't really like it.
I love that we have, so someone said it's harsh, someone said it's impolite, normal. So it can feel normal to some people, harsh, cold, harsh, too direct, feels okay with me. I'm from Israel.
Hey, there you go. All right. So we'll talk about that. Okay, let's keep it moving. Why don't you do it another way? Yeah. How about this one? Yeah, I don't know.
Like
it's
here,
a little blurry.
If I tell you, and of course, this really depends on who says it, in what moment, the tone, the voice they use for that, for sure. But Simon, if I tell you, why don't you do it another way? Do you understand that I'm asking for the reason you chose that? Or am I saying you should do it another way?
It sounds to me like you think whatever I'm doing is horrible and it's the worst thing you've ever seen, and you just want it to be done a different way. That's what, but you know, again, we create the stories that we live out. So that's just from my end, what it sounds like.
Yeah. Okay. What else do we have? Your presentation was okay. Does it mean it was 8 out of 10 or like 3 out of 10 or 10 out of 10?
And now I'm going to add an extra layer of complexity here. And we're not even talking about multi-generational communication here, but my little sister, who is Gen Z, she would say that this is extremely passive aggressive and that there needs to be 5 exclamation points and 3 hearts afterwards. Otherwise, this is very rude. But what do you think? What's your kind of takeaway here?
I would think that my presentation was not okay at all if I hear or I read this.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not your sister's generation, I think, but I still appreciate the upgraders. That's what we call them, upgraders. That was so great, absolutely amazing. The exclamation marks, but I don't know.
Yeah, there you go. You might want to consider, okay, yeah, what does that mean? From some cultures, if you hear that, you might want to consider it. It may be like, okay, I'll consider it, and I'm not going to do it. And then from some cultures, it may be, okay, wow, they really want me to do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And this is really important if your manager says this to you, right? We've had this a lot of times where someone's a manager and they said, I told them that directly. I'm like, okay, tell me exactly what you said. Exactly. And then they'll say something like this, like, yeah, you might want to consider doing that, right? And it's to a German or from a much more direct culture. And it's like, yeah, they considered it and they didn't do it. That's what that means, right? Yeah, and we have a couple more. That's an interesting idea. Okay.
This one, yeah, I guess it always depends on the context who says it. But if I hear it, that's an interesting idea, just like this, from a team member at a meeting, then I will probably think they didn't like my idea.
Okay, what if they said, that's an interesting idea?
It depends on the tone, Isabella saying the tone is crucial here. So all of this really depends on, again, many, many different things. But if we talk about general patterns, some cultures are high context and some cultures are more low context. So high context means you need a lot of context around it. They tend to be a little bit more indirect. They rely on body language. Also the tone of your voice as well. They tend to be more cooperative and avoid conflict. So again, much more indirect. We go back to, you know, they appreciate long-term relationships. They're more rooted in tradition. And then when we have low context cultures, it just means that they rely heavily on words. So there's less, it's just much more explicit. There's less fluff, there's less beating around the bush, and more direct. This is it's almost like like a spectrum, a continuum, and you can only really say if a person is low or high context when you compare them with others. Like here we have, for example, Germany and the United States as low context. But if you compare them, Germany, it's much lower context than the United States. So again, just bear in mind that there are differences. This is how people communicate in general, but it's much more nuanced than this. We also have some examples. I love that you also said in the chat before that what was it? That's wrong sounded okay. And she's from Israel. Well, this is the example that we took it from, right? So if your manager from the United States tells you, you might want to consider X, it means do it. This needs to happen. And when an Israeli tells you that's wrong, it doesn't mean that they want to be harsh. They just disagree and want to discuss it. So you can reach an agreement.
There you go. And again, think about ultimate goal is for us to work together, to create value together, right? And how do we do that? Very often we have to walk through these kind of different landmines of having our feelings hurt because of these different ways of communicating. So it's something to always consider. I was lucky to grow up in a very multicultural environment, and my father would always say, like, could this be cultural? He would always say, could this be cultural? And it was amazing that I was lucky enough to grow up in that environment, because it was the first thing I always considered. Could this be cultural? Am I jumping directly to that this person really wants to be harsh and doesn't like my idea and wants to make me feel bad? Maybe not. So again, thinking about that, right? Like when an American, for example, says definitely, right? We use these upgraders to talk about like, that's amazing, it's incredible, right? But really it's more along these lines, right? And then when we talk with Germans, right, it's like, that's a good point, or that's wrong means, yeah, no, that's wrong. But we're going to find a solution, right? It's not, it's not that's wrong and you're a bad person. It's, let's still continue to work together. I'm just communicating in a much more direct way.
That's it. So yeah, really understanding what might the other person mean, and going back to how can I ask the right follow-up questions and the right questions to find out what they truly mean. Like we said at the beginning, try to avoid yes/no questions. And here's one of the reasons why. First, because they can be leading, but also because they can have different meanings. Like yes doesn't mean the same everywhere. And I learned this the hard way again when I lived in Southeast Asia, because I would ask yes/no questions and then I would get frustrated because I was not getting the answer. But it was not them not understanding me; it was me not understanding how they communicate. So I'm curious to hear what it means for you. But in Western cultures, it usually means I understand. There's some sort of commitment with I agree or I will do it. But for example, in some parts of Asia, it just means I hear you. Like I acknowledge, it's like a way of acknowledging that you received the message, but you may not.
And you'll see this a lot. I mean, I lived in Vietnam as well. We always laugh about this is just the learning it the hard way of actually living through that cultural experience of this person told me they would do this and then didn't do it. That makes them a liar and a bad person. And then I put them in this liar box and now they're a liar, right? Or they're a bad employee or they're a bad teammate and I can't trust them, right?
Yeah.
We jump to all these steps, but we need to kind of cycle back. And sometimes it'll take you years and you'll just be like standing in the shower and it'll just hit you like, oh, okay, that's what happened. Yeah, exactly right. And that's kind of, what we see a lot is, does yes mean yes, I'm going to do this, or does it mean I hear you? And in India, for example, right, shaking the head means like I'm paying attention and we're on the same page, right? I've sat in meetings where I've been talking with someone from India and they'll just be like, shaking their head. And I'm thinking, what is happening? Am I saying something wrong? But that just means that we're on the same page, right? So, these things change over different cultures. So can you take us for some tips? If I'm a direct person, what are some tips for me?
So we are going to give some very quick tips for people who are too direct or have been told you're too direct in professional context, and for people who are too indirect. Fanny also asked in the chat, do we discuss these differences directly, or just figure them out along the way? Usually with a team, this depends on the context, of course. Usually when you have a team, I think it's important to discuss the differences, to set expectations. I worked with one of my students, and now really good friend. She wanted to create a status for Slack to say, what can I say about me? And one of my suggestions was, apart from your hobbies and things like that, why didn't you tell people how you usually like to communicate? And so if you're very direct, you can tell people, this is just my way of communicating. So it's very smart to really address the differences. But sometimes with a potential client, you cannot do that in a sales meeting. So what are some of the tips for direct people? One, try to soften your statements and demands. Try to tone them down a little bit. Listen between the lines. If someone's, if you see an eye roll, then obviously that's an indicator. Try to ask more diplomatically and be patient. So don't expect an answer straight away, because if you're talking to more indirect people, they may need more time to process the information. So instead of asking them, why not? You can tell them, could you give us a little background on that? That's a way of still being yourself, asking the question, but adapting your message to a more indirect audience. And then for indirect people, they are seen as more polite, but it's also important that they adapt so that there are clear expectations. So learn that direct people see directness as a sign of respect and trust. I know that for indirect people, being direct is like, but I don't want to be harsh. I don't want to be impolite. But if you're talking to direct people, they see that as a good thing. And here is where you can combine diplomacy with clarity and explicit messages. So not everything has to be harsh or super indirect. Try to compromise. Find that middle point in there. Always, always, always ask questions to double check understanding, and give time frames if you don't have an immediate response. You may not have the answer yet, but try to give some time frames. So for example, instead of saying, that's a good point, perhaps we could also check if this other method works. Here, I don't know if you're telling me, is it good? Is it that? Do you want me to change anything? Is this a suggestion? Is this what is this?
Right.
You can make your message more clear by saying, can we try this other method? I believe it could work better because, and that's where you're not being super direct, but you're being explicit enough.
Right. You at least like putting in the kind of the what you want to get out of this, right? Or what's the difference that you would like to happen? Because very often, that if I'm looking on the left-hand side, I'm having to jump to conclusions as a more direct person, right? Giving timelines, I think, is a huge one. Just for more direct people, very often think in things of very kind of segmented time, deadlines. So if you give a time frame, I know when someone gives me a time frame, I feel much more relaxed. Like, okay, then I know I have that time frame to look.
Super important. Yes.
Yeah.
I know we're wanting to talk about time perception, but because we're going to send the slides and we said that there's so much to cover, we're going to skip it for now, but make sure that you open that email that I'm going to send probably tomorrow with all the slides, and we're going to skip through it. You have a lot of tips on how time is perceived across cultures. And I'd love to just jump straight to the final thoughts. Simon, what do you think?
Yeah. So, okay, final thoughts. And we did cover a lot of the time perception points previously, just around how we consider time. But again, we'll send out all the slides to check that out. Final thoughts, if you're integrating a team, you have a new team, it's intercultural, people coming from all different places. Think about a team code. What can we do together? How can we create agreements on how we're going to communicate as a team? Consider scheduling. We're all working remotely, different times. really consider that. Being considerate about when you put times on schedules is huge. Create a code around best practices for meetings, right? What does that look like? And then ensuring that there's a feedback mechanism for people from more direct and indirect cultures. That's huge. Ensuring that there's a way for, if you're from a direct culture, that maybe one of your employees or team members that's coming from an indirect culture can still provide feedback to you in a way that's comfortable for them, because many times they get left out of the picture if they're not right there and in front, right? So there's a lot of different things that we can take in. We're going to do more. So, this is just part one. And I hope, again, you're walking away with a lot of different tools. There's a ton of tips here. Definitely, again, starting from the self, right? How do we start from the self? And then how do we kind of navigate through these different points around building trust and collaborating? And as always, right, keep learning. So we have free resources, and then we have a ton of different learning options. So that's one-on-one training, group training, webinars. We do a bunch of stuff, but yeah, check out our free resources while you have time. Check out the podcast. It's Paula and myself that do it. So, if
You're not
you're
tired of listening to us.
yeah, if you're not tired,
Keep
I
listening to
can't listen
us.
to it. Yeah, exactly right. I know my cat is probably very tired of me by now. That's another story. Paula, anything else before we leave it for today?
What else? What else? I think you did a great wrap up. Just really go back to the slides and try to apply some of these tips. We always access we monitor, and I'm also monitoring this hello@talaera.com. So if you ever have any feedback, we read every single message, really every single message, and we try to act on it. Just like we were reading your chat. I know Niraja was here, Simon. I don't know if you saw her, but she also typed in the chat. So if you're still there, hello, and thank you so much for joining. We always love to read what everyone thinks, and just let us know what else we can keep working on. It's all we try to keep it very human and very real. So we really want to learn, okay, how can we make your life better? We were talking about helping people join the conversation. Sometimes we feel like, okay, my English is really good, but it's just, there's a click that I need to work on that doesn't allow me to join the conversation in real time. I need to think for too long, and I'm not sure if this is appropriate, if this is not. So yeah, that's the part we're trying to figure out. Come hang out on LinkedIn. Any other social media platform that you like, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. As always, we try to keep everything super personalized. And so, let us know if there's anything that you want to learn about. We're just consistently, when I say we, I mean Paula is consistently creating content. So just, let her know. But as always, we always end all of our webinars with keep learning, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Awesome. This was fun.
Yeah, it was great. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
All
you.
right. Have a great one. Okay. See you, everybody.
See you.